In 1941, 14,000 Australian soldiers are surrounded by Rommel's unstoppable Afrika Korps with no hope of rescue. Yet they'll turn the hunters into the hunted and hand Nazi Germany its first land defeat of the entire war. American forces will later get the same desert training, face the same enemy, and suffer catastrophic losses within days, where the Australians held for 8 months. What did a bunch of school teachers and sheep farmers from Australia understand about desert warfare that America's professional army completely missed? The sound came first, a rising scream that split the morning sky like tearing metal. Then the explosion. Limestone dust erupted from the harbor as another Stuka dive bomber pulled up from its attack run, the signature wail of its siren echoing off the ancient fortress walls. Another scream, another blast. The German pilots had been doing this for 3 days straight, more than 200 bombing runs every single day, turning the Mediterranean port into a landscape of craters and twisted steel. Major General Leslie Morshead stood in a communications trench, limestone grit coating his uniform, and watched his men dig deeper into the North African earth. 14,000 Australian soldiers now occupied this coastal fortress, and they were completely surrounded. Rommel's Afrika Korps had arrived with 45,000 troops, Italian infantry, and 150 tanks that gleamed in the desert sun like a mechanical herd of predators. The panzers sat just beyond artillery range, waiting. Everyone knew what came next. The Germans had perfected a way of fighting that turned armies into dust in days, not months. They called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it had crushed Poland in 4 weeks and France in 6. Now, those same tactics, those same commanders, those same unstoppable tanks were pointed at Tobruk like a loaded gun. The math was simple and brutal. Morshead's garrison had 45 anti-tank guns. Rommel had 150 panzers. The British military manuals said you needed 3 defenders for every attacker to hold ground. Tobruk had 1 defender for every 3 attackers. The textbooks said the position was indefensible. The radio messages from Cairo said the same thing. Evacuate, withdraw. Save what you can before the panzers roll through and turn 14,000 men into prisoners of war. Morshead was 51 years old, a former school teacher who had taught history and mathematics before the First War pulled him into uniform. He had fought at Gallipoli in the mud and blood of that failed invasion and survived battles that killed better soldiers. He understood what the manuals said. He also understood that manuals were written by men who had never stood in a trench and felt the ground shake from incoming shells. The British commanders in Cairo were good men, educated at proper military schools, trained in proper military tactics. They looked at Tobruk and saw a death trap. They calculated the numbers and recommended retreat. They were thinking like generals. Morshead was thinking like a man who had to explain to soldiers why they were going to die. But as he walked the 30-mile perimeter that circled Tobruk, something caught his attention that the textbooks never mentioned. The ground itself was fighting for them. North Africa wasn't flat sand like people imagined. The limestone plateau around Tobruk was cut with wadis, deep ravines carved by ancient floods that created natural trenches and hidden approaches. The rock was soft enough to dig but hard enough to stop shrapnel. Every few hundred yards, the terrain shifted, creating blind spots and dead zones where tanks couldn't see and infantry couldn't advance without exposing themselves to crossfire. This wasn't farmland in France where panzers could race across open fields. This was broken ground, angry ground, ground that punished attackers and rewarded defenders who knew how to use it. The other thing Morshead noticed was his men. These weren't parade ground soldiers. They were sheep farmers and dock workers, miners and truck drivers, men who had grown up in the Australian outback where everything tried to kill you and you learned to kill it first. They didn't salute much. They called officers by their first names. They treated military regulations like suggestions. British officers complained the Australians lacked discipline. Morshead saw something else. He saw men who thought for themselves, who adapted without being told, who would fight dirty if fighting dirty meant staying alive. On the fourth day of the siege, a German officer was captured during a probe of the eastern defences. He was young, confident, his uniform still clean despite the desert dust. During questioning, he smiled and told the interpreter that Tobruk would fall within a week. Rommel himself had said so. The Afrika Korps had never failed to take an objective. The Italians had failed here before. Yes, but Italians weren't Germans. The panzers would come, the Stukas would soften the defenses, and the infantry would march in and accept surrender. It was simply a matter of time and overwhelming force. The German officer seemed genuinely puzzled that anyone would try to defend Tobruk at all. Why die for a dusty port that meant nothing? Why not surrender with honor and avoid the slaughter? Morshead listened to the translation and dismissed the prisoner. Then he called his senior officers together in a dugout that smelled of sand and sweat. Outside, the Stukas screamed through another bombing run. The limestone walls shook but held. Morshead unrolled a map on a wooden crate and put his finger on the perimeter. The British wanted to sit here and absorb attacks until they broke or starved. The Germans expected them to sit here and absorb attacks until they broke or starved. Everyone was thinking about defense as a passive thing, a matter of building walls and hoping they held. But Morshead had fought at Gallipoli, and he remembered what killed soldiers in siege warfare. It wasn't the attacks, it was the waiting. Men sitting in trenches day after day, taking casualties, watching friends die, feeling trapped and helpless until their spirits broke before their lines did. The German officer had been right about one thing. Time was the enemy, but time didn't have to favor the attackers. What if the defenders refused to sit still? What if they made Rommel's troops dread the night the way Morshead's men dreaded the day? What if Tobruk stopped being a fortress and became a hunting ground? The officers stared at him. One captain, a veteran of the fighting in Greece, asked the obvious question: hunt with what? They were outnumbered 3-1, outgunned worse than that, and surrounded by an enemy that specialized in mobile warfare. How do you hunt tanks? Morshead smiled for the first time in days. You don't hunt the tanks, he said. You hunt the men inside them. You hunt the supply trucks. You hunt the forward positions. You hunt anything that moves after dark and make them afraid to leave their lines. Make them think twice before every patrol. Make them waste resources watching their own backs. Make them tired. Make them scared. Make them bleed. It was the opposite of everything the manuals taught. Defense meant holding ground, absorbing attacks, maintaining discipline and formation. What Morshead was proposing was something else entirely, something that didn't have a name yet. Aggressive defense. Raiding as doctrine, turning trapped soldiers into nocturnal predators. The British textbooks didn't have a chapter on this. The German textbooks certainly didn't. But Morshead had seen it work in the First War. Small unit actions that disrupted enemy plans and bought time when time was the only resource left. And now, standing in a besieged fortress with nowhere to retreat and no hope of quick relief, time was exactly what they needed to buy. The question was whether 14,000 exhausted soldiers could learn to fight like something Rommel had never faced before. The answer would determine whether Tobruk became another name on Germany's list of lightning victories or the place where lightning finally struck back. The first patrols went out on April 10th, just 3 nights into the siege. Morshead sent out 9 men from the 2nd Battalion, their orders simple and strange. Move 800 yards beyond the perimeter wire. Find German positions. Bring back prisoners if possible. Bring back information if not. Do not engage unless you have surprise. Do not make noise. Do not get caught. The men looked at each other like they had been given a mission from a different war, which in a way they had. British defense doctrine said you held your lines and shot anything that approached. These orders said to leave the safety of the trenches and walk into the dark where thousands of enemy soldiers waited. The patrol leader was a corporal from Queensland who had hunted wild pigs in the bush before the war. He understood stalking. He understood moving through hostile terrain without being seen. He also understood that German sentries would shoot first and ask questions never, so every step had to be silent and every shadow had to hide you. The 9 men wrapped cloth around their boots to muffle footsteps on limestone. They blackened their faces with burnt cork from wine bottles. They left behind anything that rattled or reflected light. Watches, identity tags, extra ammunition, canteens half full of water that sloshed. They carried knives and grenades and Thompson submachine guns, weapons for close-range work, weapons for when stealth failed and violence became the only option. The night was cold, the kind of desert cold that surprised people who thought Africa was all heat and sand. The men crawled through a wadi that cut northeast toward German lines, moving in single file, stopping every few minutes to listen. Somewhere ahead, voices spoke in German. Cigarette smoke drifted on the breeze, which meant sentries who felt safe enough to smoke. The corporal held up a fist and the patrol froze. They could hear boots on rock, 2 guards walking a perimeter patrol maybe 50 yards ahead. The corporal made hand signals. Circle left, stay low, wait for them to pass. The Australians melted into the shadows, not moving, barely breathing, while 2 German soldiers walked within 20 feet and never saw them. After midnight, they found what they were looking for. A forward machine gun post, 4 Germans manning an MG-34 with ammunition boxes stacked beside a sandbag wall. The gun covered the main approach to the eastern sector, positioned to cut down any daylight assault with interlocking fire. It was well placed and well built. It was also isolated, positioned 300 yards ahead of the main German line to serve as an early warning post. That isolation made it vulnerable. The corporal counted to 3 and the patrol rushed the position from 3 sides at once. The Germans never got off a shot. Within 30 seconds, it was over. 3 prisoners with their hands up, 1 dead German, and 1 captured machine gun that the Australians wrecked with a grenade before pulling back with their captives. The interrogation happened at dawn. The 3 German soldiers were young, maybe 19 or 20, part of a supply unit pressed into sentry duty. They talked easily once they realized nobody was going to shoot them. They gave up details about unit strength, supply routes, rotation schedules, and the location of ammunition dumps. They also mentioned something interesting. The German troops around Tobruk were tired. Not exhausted, but tired in the way that comes from weeks of fighting without rest. The Afrika Korps had driven hundreds of miles across Libya, fighting the whole way, and now they sat outside Tobruk, waiting for orders to attack a fortress everyone said would fall in days. But days were passing and the fortress wasn't falling, and men were starting to wonder why they hadn't already rolled through like they did everywhere else. Morshead read the interrogation report and saw an opening. Tired troops made mistakes. Tired troops got sloppy. Tired troops could be made more tired. He increased the patrols to 20 men per night, then 40, then 60. Every night, Australian soldiers crawled into the dark and found German positions. Sometimes they grabbed prisoners, sometimes they destroyed equipment, sometimes they just watched and reported, gathering information that built a detailed picture of enemy deployments and routines. The Germans responded by increasing their own patrols, which meant more soldiers awake at night, more resources spent on security, more energy wasted watching for threats instead of preparing attacks. The Australian soldiers adapted faster than anyone expected. They learned that German sentries changed every 2 hours, which meant the first 15 minutes and last 15 minutes of each shift were the most dangerous because fresh guards were alert and tired guards were nervous. They learned that Italian units smoked more than Germans and talked louder, making them easier to avoid or easier to raid depending on the objective. They learned that certain wadis collected cold air that carried sound farther, while others created dead zones where you could move without being heard. Within 2 weeks, the Australians were moving through German lines like ghosts, appearing where they shouldn't be, striking where least expected, vanishing before reinforcements could respond. The engineers got creative. They captured German telemines, the big anti-tank explosives shaped like metal plates. Standard mines required 200 pounds of pressure to detonate, which meant trucks and tanks triggered them, but infantry didn't. Australian engineers reduced the pressure triggers to 90 pounds. Now, a running soldier could set one off, and German patrols started losing men to their own captured mines in places where mines shouldn't exist. The Australians also discovered that Italian hand grenades fit perfectly inside metal thermos bottles. Pack 4 grenades in a thermos, add some scrap metal for extra shrapnel, bury it with a pressure trigger, and you had a homemade bomb that turned footpaths into death traps. The digging never stopped. Australian infantry excavated more than 500 fighting positions connected by communication trenches exactly 4 feet deep, the perfect height for a man to move while staying below ground level. Every position had overhead cover against Stuka bombs, multiple firing angles to create crossfire zones, and escape routes in case of being overrun. The positions were spaced to support each other, but far enough apart that artillery couldn't destroy multiple positions with one barrage. From the air, Tobruk looked like a military base. From the ground, it was an underground city connected by tunnels where 14,000 men lived like moles and emerged at night to hunt. British officers visiting from Cairo walked the trenches and couldn't believe what they were seeing. This wasn't textbook defense. This was something improvised and brutal and strangely effective. One British colonel watched an Australian patrol prepare for a night raid and asked the lieutenant in charge where he learned these tactics. The lieutenant, a former sheep farmer from New South Wales, said he learned them hunting dingoes that attacked his flock at night. You couldn't chase dingoes in daylight because they were too fast and too smart, but at night, if you were patient and quiet and mean enough, you could get close and kill them before they knew you were there. Same principle applied to Germans, he said, just bigger dingoes with better guns. Not everyone believed it would work, Some British staff officers argued that raids were wasting resources and risking men for marginal gains. Better to conserve strength and wait for relief. But then the reports started coming in from German prisoners. They talked about low morale, about fear of night operations, about losing men to invisible attackers who struck and vanished. One captured officer mentioned that his company had been rotated to Tobruk for what should have been easy garrison duty, but after 2 weeks of Australian raids, they were being pulled back to rest and refit. They had taken more casualties from night raids than they had in the previous month of conventional fighting. The turning point came in late April when Australian patrols hit 3 different Italian positions in one night and brought back 800 prisoners with minimal losses. 800 men captured in one operation by raiders who weren't supposed to exist according to standard defense doctrine. The news reached Churchill in London, and suddenly Tobruk wasn't just another siege. It was a story of defiance, a symbol that Germany could be stopped and beaten by soldiers willing to fight in ways Germany didn't expect. Churchill started calling them the rats of Tobruk in speeches, turning Rommel's own propaganda insult into a badge of honor. Rommel had called them rats because they hid in holes and came out at night. Churchill made it sound like the highest praise, like being called a rat by Rommel meant you were doing something right. Rommel himself noticed. His diary entries from May show frustration with what he called extremely active enemy reconnaissance. His intelligence reports described Australian combat patrols that operated with unusual freedom and caused disproportionate disruption. He started pulling veteran units back from Tobruk for rest, not because they had taken heavy casualties in failed attacks, but because the constant night raids and psychological pressure were wearing them down faster than combat normally did. German soldiers started requiring 2 to 3 weeks of rest after rotation through Tobruk positions, compared to days or a week after other combat operations. The siege was costing Rommel more than tanks and ammunition. It was costing him time and morale, the two things Blitzkrieg depended on to maintain momentum and shock. By June, the Luftwaffe had reduced sorties from 200 per day to 40. German bombers were being pulled back to support operations in Russia, but they also weren't achieving results in Tobruk that justified the losses. Australian anti-aircraft gunners had learned to wait until dive bombers committed to their attack runs before opening fire, which meant Stukas couldn't pull up without flying through a wall of exploding shells. The bombs still fell and men still died, but the harbour kept working and the supplies kept coming in on fast ships that raced across the Mediterranean at night. Tobruk wasn't falling. More importantly, Tobruk was fighting back in ways that didn't fit any German playbook for how besieged fortresses were supposed to behave. The siege lasted 242 days, from April to December of 1941. During those 8 months, Australian patrols conducted more than 140 major raids beyond the perimeter wire. They captured 3,000 prisoners. They killed or wounded more than 8,000 German and Italian soldiers. Their own casualties were 3,100 men, killed, wounded, or missing. The numbers told a story that military historians would study for decades. A surrounded garrison, outnumbered 3 to 1, had inflicted nearly 3 times as many casualties as it suffered while holding ground everyone said was indefensible. The math didn't make sense unless you understood that the Australians had rewritten the rules about what defense meant. German units rotated through Tobruk and came out changed. Letters captured from prisoners described sleepless nights waiting for attacks that might not come, or might come from any direction, or might be a feint to cover a real attack somewhere else. One German corporal wrote home that fighting in Tobruk was worse than fighting in France, because in France you knew where the enemy was and what they were trying to do. In Tobruk, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. And every night you went to sleep wondering if you would wake up to grenades and gunfire and Australians who appeared like demons from the dark. Another letter described how his platoon had stopped patrolling at night entirely because 3 patrols in a row had been ambushed and wiped out. Better to stay in the trenches and let the Australians own the night than lose more men trying to fight on ground they controlled. Rommel tried everything. He concentrated artillery fire on suspected patrol routes. He sent out larger German patrols with better training and night fighting equipment. He even tried his own raids against Australian positions, hoping to catch them off guard the way they caught his troops off guard. Nothing worked consistently. The Australians knew the ground too well. B. They had spent months turning the wadis and limestone outcrops into a 3-dimensional maze they could navigate by feel, while German troops were still learning the terrain. Every failed German raid cost men and equipment. Every successful Australian raid brought back intelligence that made the next raid easier. The fortress itself had become something new. The trenches were so deep and well connected that men could move supplies across miles of front line without ever appearing above ground. Observation posts hidden in collapsed buildings gave perfect fields of fire across approaches that looked empty to German scouts. Australian snipers learned the daily routines of German positions and took shots timed to cause maximum disruption, killing officers during morning briefings or destroying water supplies during the hottest part of the day. The psychological impact was worse than the physical casualties. German soldiers started to feel like they were being watched all the time, that every movement was observed and noted, that the Australians knew where they were and what they were doing even when they couldn't see them. The heat made everything worse. Summer in North Africa turned the desert into an oven that cooked metal until you couldn't touch it without gloves. Temperatures inside tanks reached 140 degrees. Water became worth more than ammunition. German supply lines stretched hundreds of miles across empty desert, vulnerable to British air attacks and mechanical breakdowns. Tobruk's garrison received supplies by ship. Dangerous runs across water patrolled by German submarines and aircraft, but the sea route was shorter and more reliable than the overland routes Rommel depended on. The siege became a race to see who would run out of resources first, and the Australians had figured out how to make their enemies burn through supplies faster by forcing them to maintain constant readiness against raids that might happen anywhere at any time. September brought American observers. The United States wasn't officially in the war yet, but everyone knew it was coming. Army officers arrived to study desert warfare and learn from British and Australian experience. They watched the raids, they read the intelligence reports, they interviewed the diggers and asked questions about tactics and training. The Americans were impressed, but also skeptical. These methods worked for Australians, sure, but Australians were different. They had grown up in harsh country. They were comfortable operating with minimal supervision. Could American troops, raised on very different terrain and trained in very different military traditions, learn to fight the same way? The Australian officers said maybe, but probably not without spending months under siege learning the hard way like they had. You couldn't teach this in training camp. You learned it by doing it, by making mistakes and watching friends die and figuring out what worked through trial and error under fire. The American observers left in October with notebooks full of information and a healthy respect for the rats of Tobruk. They reported back that desert warfare required different tactics than European warfare, that mobility mattered more than firepower, that night operations were essential against a mobile enemy, that water discipline and vehicle maintenance were as important as marksmanship. The reports were filed and studied. Training programs were adjusted. American troops headed to North Africa received extra instruction in desert operations based on lessons learned at Tobruk. Everyone thought they were prepared. Then came February 1943 at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. American forces met Rommel's Afrika Korps in their first major engagement. The battle lasted 6 days. The Americans lost 6,500 men, killed, wounded, or captured. German casualties were under 1,000. Rommel's panzers broke through American lines like they were made of paper. American tanks, superior in some ways to German panzers, were outmaneuvered and destroyed by crews with more experience. American infantry, well-equipped and well-trained, broke under concentrated assault by troops who had been fighting in the desert for years. American radio discipline collapsed, with units broadcasting in the clear and giving away their positions. The sand-choked engines that hadn't been properly maintained. The sun turned vehicles into ovens for men who hadn't learned to ration water. The speed of armored warfare overwhelmed soldiers who had trained for it but never experienced the reality of panzers appearing on your flank faster than you could react. An Australian veteran visiting American positions after Kasserine watched the demoralized troops and said something that got repeated in enough letters home that it became almost famous. He said the Americans fought by the book we learned to burn. He didn't mean it as an insult exactly. He meant that books were written by people who had never stood in the desert and felt it try to kill them. Books were theory. Tobruk had been 8 months of practice under conditions where mistakes meant death. The Americans had training. The Australians had knowledge earned one night raid at a time over 242 days of being surrounded and hunted and learning to hunt back. The difference showed in details that seemed small until they added up. Australian soldiers knew to wrap scarves around their faces during sandstorms to keep breathing. Americans didn't and suffocated when storms hit during combat. Australians knew which wadis collected water after rain and which ones stayed dry. Americans didn't and got caught in flash floods. Australians knew how to maintain vehicles in sand by stripping air filters and cleaning them 3 times a day. Americans didn't and lost entire columns to mechanical failure. Australians knew to dig deeper than you thought necessary because German artillery always zeroed in on movement. Americans dug shallow and died in their trenches. The biggest difference was psychological. The Australians at Tobruk had spent 8 months learning that Rommel's forces could be beaten, that German tactics had weaknesses, that panzer crews were human and got tired and made mistakes. The Americans at Kasserine still believed the propaganda about German invincibility. When the attack came, some units fought hard and well. Others panicked and ran because they expected to lose, and therefore did. Expectations mattered. The rats of Tobruk had expected to die and decided to make their deaths expensive, which turned into refusing to die at all. The Americans at Kasserine expected a fair fight and got ambushed by an enemy that didn't fight fair and never had. One captured American officer, interviewed by British intelligence after his release, explained how the Germans at Kasserine seemed to know exactly what the Americans would do before they did it. Every move was countered. Every position was flanked. Every withdrawal turned into a rout. It felt like fighting an enemy that could read minds. The British officer doing the interview had served at Tobruk. He explained that Rommel wasn't reading minds. He was reading doctrine. American forces followed their training, which meant they were predictable. The Australians at Tobruk had thrown out the training manual after the first week and invented tactics that Rommel had never seen before, which made them unpredictable and therefore dangerous in ways that textbook soldiers never were. The sound of Kasserine was different too. American survivors talked about the screaming, the chaos, the overwhelming noise of tank guns and artillery, and men dying. Australian veterans remembered Tobruk as mostly quiet, long stretches of silence broken by sudden violence that ended as fast as it started. Quick raids, efficient killing, then back to the trenches before the enemy could organize a response. The Americans at Kasserine had fought a conventional battle and lost conventionally. The Australians at Tobruk had refused to fight conventionally at all, and that refusal had saved their lives and handed Germany its first defeat on land. The siege of Tobruk ended in December 1941, when British forces finally broke through Rommel's lines and relieved the garrison. The rats marched out of their holes into sunlight they had barely seen for 8 months, blinking like men emerging from caves, thin and exhausted and alive when everyone had expected them to be dead. They had held a fortress everyone said was indefensible. They had fought off an army everyone said was unstoppable. They had proven that blitzkrieg could be defeated by soldiers willing to adapt faster than their enemies could react. The victory wasn't flashy. Nobody surrendered dramatically or signed peace treaties, but it mattered because it showed the world that Nazi Germany could lose, that the war wasn't already over, that resistance was possible even when surrounded and outnumbered and outgunned. But across the ocean, American forces were preparing for their own desert war. They studied reports from Tobruk, trained in desert conditions, and believed they were ready. What they didn't realize was that 8 months of siege warfare had given the Australians something no training program could provide: the hard-won knowledge of how to survive against Rommel when survival seemed impossible. That gap between training and experience would cost American lives at Kasserine Pass. The tactics developed at Tobruk didn't disappear. They evolved. The Australian Army created permanent commando units modeled directly on the patrol methods invented during the siege. Small teams trained in night operations, silent movement, close quarters combat, living off minimal supplies deep behind enemy lines. The British military incorporated aggressive raiding into their commando training programs. Special forces from multiple countries studied the Tobruk after-action reports and borrowed the lessons that fit their needs. The idea of defense as active rather than passive became standard doctrine, not just for sieges, but for any situation where mobility and surprise could compensate for lack of numbers or firepower. Morshead received a knighthood for his leadership at Tobruk. Sir Leslie Morshead. He commanded other operations later in the war, successful ones, but nothing matched the impact of those 8 months in the desert. After the war, he went back to teaching, running a boys' school in Sydney, rarely talking about his military career except when former soldiers visited and wanted to share memories. He had been offered positions in government and business, chances to trade on his fame, but he preferred classrooms to boardrooms. He had been a teacher who became a general because the times demanded it, and when the times changed, he went back to being a teacher. His students remembered him as strict but fair, a man who expected effort and rewarded results, someone who believed that any problem could be solved if you were willing to think differently than everyone else. The legacy of Tobruk went deeper than tactics and medals. It became a story about what ordinary people could accomplish when systems failed them. The British military establishment had written off Tobruk as a lost cause. The experts had done the math and declared defeat inevitable. The professionals had recommended retreat as the only sensible option. And they had all been wrong because they had forgotten something fundamental about warfare. Wars aren't decided by spreadsheets and staff meetings. They're decided by individual human beings making choices under pressure, adapting to circumstances, refusing to accept defeat just because someone with more education said defeat was logical. The Australians at Tobruk were sheep farmers and dock workers and miners, men with no formal military education beyond basic training. They faced professional soldiers from an army that had conquered most of Europe. And they won by ignoring everything the professionals said and inventing their own way of fighting based on what actually worked rather than what textbooks said should work. That pattern repeated throughout history, but people kept forgetting it because institutional knowledge always pushed back against innovation. The experts always said the new way was wrong until the new way won, and then they claimed they had supported it all along. The Americans learned eventually. After Kasserine Pass, after more defeats and hard lessons, they adapted. American forces in Italy and France fought very differently than American forces in Tunisia. They learned the value of flexibility over doctrine, initiative over following orders, practical experience over theoretical training. But they learned the hard way, through casualties that might have been avoided if the lessons of Tobruk had been truly understood rather than just studied. You can read about night raids in a manual and still not understand what it feels like to crawl through darkness knowing that one mistake means death. You can memorize desert survival techniques and still panic when a sandstorm hits during combat. Knowledge and understanding are different things. And understanding only comes from experience that most people, thankfully, never have to gain. Modern special forces still study Tobruk. The patrol reports are in military archives, available to anyone who wants to read them. The tactics have been refined and improved with better technology, night vision and drones, and satellite communications, but the core principles remain the same. Small teams moving independently against larger forces, raids designed to disrupt rather than destroy, psychological pressure applied continuously over time until the enemy breaks from exhaustion rather than combat losses. The methods work because they exploit weaknesses in conventional military thinking, the assumption that bigger forces with better equipment will always defeat smaller forces with worse equipment. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. The difference depends on whether the smaller force is willing to fight in ways the bigger force doesn't expect and can't easily counter. The lesson people take from Tobruk depends on what they're looking for. Military historians see it as a case study in defensive tactics and the importance of terrain. Leadership experts point to Moorehead's ability to inspire confidence and encourage innovation under pressure. Australians remember it as proof that their soldiers could match anyone in the world, despite coming from a small country far from the centers of power. All of those interpretations are true as far as they go, but the deeper lesson is about institutional courage, about the willingness to question authority when authority is wrong, about trusting your own judgment based on direct experience rather than deferring to experts who have never faced your particular circumstances. This brings us back to why American desert veterans couldn't match the rats of Tobruk. The Americans at Kasserine weren't cowards. They were brave men who followed their training and suffered for it because their training was based on European warfare, and they were fighting in Africa against an enemy that specialized in exploiting mistakes. Their institutional structure said, follow the plan, maintain formations, coordinate with higher command before taking initiative. The Australians at Tobruk had learned to ignore institutional structure when it got in the way of staying alive. Their units operated semi-independently because strict command and control was impossible during night raids. Their tactics evolved daily based on what worked last night and what didn't. They had the freedom to experiment because nobody in Cairo really understood what they were doing anyway, so nobody interfered with methods that seemed chaotic but produced results. That freedom made all the difference. You can't manufacture that in peacetime. Training exercises have safety nets and do-overs. Real combat has death and consequences that can't be undone. The psychological pressure of knowing that mistakes kill your friends creates learning conditions that no training program can replicate. The Australians had 242 days of that pressure. The Americans had weeks before facing Rommel. It wasn't enough time. It was never going to be enough time. Some things can only be learned by doing, and by the time you learn them, you're either dead or different in ways that peacetime soldiers can never quite understand. The final irony is that Rommel himself respected the rats of Tobruk more than most of his other opponents. After the war, in the memoirs he wrote before his forced suicide, he described the Australian defence as one of the finest examples of military courage and tactical innovation he encountered. He had fought the French, the British, the Americans, the Russians. The Australians at Tobruk impressed him because they refused to fight the way he expected. They turned his own methods against him, using mobility and surprise and night operations to negate his advantages in armor and air power. They beat him at his own game by changing the rules of the game, and that earned respect even from an enemy who had every reason to hate them. Today, if you visit Tobruk, you can still see the trenches. Wind and time have softened the edges, but the network remains. Miles of tunnels and fighting positions carved into limestone by men who expected to die there. Tour guides tell the story to visitors who try to imagine what it was like, the heat and fear and constant danger, 242 days of being surrounded with no guarantee of rescue. Most people can't really imagine it. That's probably good. Some experiences should stay in the past, but the lesson remains relevant because the pattern keeps repeating. Conventional wisdom says one thing, reality says another. People who survive are usually the ones who figure out which one to trust. The question isn't whether you have better equipment or more troops or superior training. The question is whether you can adapt faster than your enemy can respond, whether you can think differently when everyone else is thinking the same way, whether you have the courage to ignore the experts when the experts are leading you toward defeat. The Australians at Tobruk answered yes to all those questions. The Americans at Kasserine didn't, not at first. Eventually, they learned, but learning cost lives that might have been saved if institutional knowledge had mattered less than practical wisdom. If the book everyone studied had been written by the rats who survived rather than the generals who watched from a distance and thought they understood.